Hello, friends. It's Jean Miele. This hopefully brief screencast is to review printer settings for inkjet printing, in this case on an Epson printer from Lightroom. Everything I say here will generalize to other brands of printers, but what you'll see is that I'll be printing from an Epson 3880. We can start with an image that I've already developed. And what you'll notice about this image is that if we look at the before by going into the develop module, that the initial raw file is extremely flat. The primary thing that we're looking for, or the primary things that we're looking for in terms of a file to print from, is we're looking for our own imprint, our own style, our own flavor on the image. And I think we've got that here, but we're also looking for a full range of tones. So if you take a look at the histogram, you'll see that we're definitely in the realm of having real black, and the right side of the histogram that indicates whites is not touching the right, but it's as close as possible without burning out any important details. That full range of tones is important in the sense that if the image is flat, that is, if we don't have real black and we don't have real white, then the image is gray numerically on the screen and will never be anything more than gray when you make the print. What you see with a flat image is there's a space on the left side of the histogram and a space on the right side. And what that indicates is that we have no actual black and no actual white. And so I'm going to go back to this point and we're going to go into the print module. In the print module, there are a number of settings that are critical, but really the most important part, in addition to understanding the basic page setup and the printer settings, is using the correct profile in the correct place. So where I'm going to start here is I'm going to go down to the print job module at the bottom of the right side of the print module, and we're going to change from managed by printer to other. Managed by printer is an autopilot, and we want to be doing this manually. So when I click on other, if I have properly installed my printer driver, my profiles will show up. And what you'll see is these are all profiles that are specific to the Epson 3880. By checking the profile that I'm going to be using, let's say premium luster, what happens is that profile or that translator ends up showing here under color management. So we're no longer on autopilot, and we are printing to the profile that will translate this file to the Epson 3880 with premium luster paper and photo black ink. I'm just going to take a moment and open up this dialog box again to remind you that if I include the display profiles, we suddenly get a list of profiles that includes all kinds of stuff that you don't want to use for printing. Adobe RGB 1998, for example, that's a working color space. That's the set of crayons that you use to make your picture. Or Dell 2408 WFP. That's a profile that's used by the system software to bring the monitor into, to show us the monitor with standardized colors that have been created by a custom calibration. So when you calibrate your monitor, the profile that gets generated doesn't get used for printing. It only gets used by the system software when the computer starts up in order to change the color of the monitor from what it was to the corrected standardized color that that profile will change it to on startup. Similarly, you don't want to print with the working color space that is Adobe RGB 1998, ProPhoto RGB, or sRGB, for example. Those are working color spaces and not used for printing. So if I click OK, what we have is we have this indicator that we're no longer on autopilot. We're printing with a 3880, and we've selected the appropriate profile for the paper and printer that we're using. That's, I think, where most people go wrong. Now, the rest is kind of details, but there are a lot of details. So let me go into page setup, bottom left here. And what we're doing is we're making sure we're formatting for this printer, and we're choosing a paper size. In this case, let's print to 11 by 14. You could choose the regular 11 by 14, but what I prefer generally is sheet feeder borderless retained size. And the reason I prefer this is because it provides borders that are 0, 0, 0, 0. And this makes it more intuitive to set up your print layout. If we go to regular 11 by 14, then we get these 0.12 borders, and it's just less intuitive for me. Of course, if you're using super thick paper, depending on the printer, you may want to use one of the manual feeds. But again, we don't want auto, we would want retain size. So here we are at sheet feeder borderless retain size. In this case, I'm going to switch to landscape so that it displays the picture for me, oriented the way the picture should be. Again, I'm going for intuitive. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be very, very brief about this layout module. I'm just going to say that you can control the way this works by setting up the number of rows that you want, by the number of columns that you want. You can move things on the page using the sliders for the margins, and the general overall size of the image is determined by the cell size. So if I want to float this on the paper, I can reduce the cell size, and then I can push it up from the bottom in order to leave room for a signature. What I will say is, if you want more information about Lightroom in general or Adobe products, Julianne Cost is a great source of information. She's a friend, and her job title, what it says on her business card, is Adobe Senior Evangelist. So go to her YouTube channel and you'll be able to find something about the print module and about layout, or about all kinds of other stuff about Photoshop and Lightroom. Another super reliable source for Lightroom information is the Lightroom Queen. And one of my favorite things is, if you type in shortcuts in the search bar on her website, it'll take you to this. You can download a sheet that has all of the keyboard commands for Lightroom. Super, super useful. So back to the print module. There are templates already existing. You can use those. Once you have things the way you want it, you can save those templates as a new template so you can use it again. That's the way the image sits on the page. Let's start at the top. So you can choose one of these as your start, or one of these as your start. I prefer to start with 0, 0, 0 margins. There are all kinds of other options I'm not going to go into. I'm going to stick with the most critical things. Among the most critical things is that Lightroom doesn't provide a lot of information about resolution. And so under guides, what you want to do is you want to check show guides. And if you check nothing else, check dimensions. And what that gives you is it gives you this little box that tells you that the image size for this setup is 12 by 8 at 664 pixels per inch. That means that the original file has enough pixels to make a print at this size. I would say, and this is opinion, anything under 240 pixels per inch is not going to give you enough image information to make a good print. This is related to the print resolution setting. I would only check this if your file is too small to print and you need to interpolate it to 240 in order to make the print. You'll notice that when I check this and uncheck it, this dialog up here changes. What this dialog box does, what this checkbox does, is it takes however many pixels you have and makes them 240 pixels per inch for the size that you're set up at. So even if your file is a single pixel, it's going to make it 240 pixels per inch. Even if your file is thousands of pixels, it's going to discard those. So I recommend leaving this off unless you're enlarging. As I said, set up at 11 by 14, printing 12 by 8. We have more than enough pixels. You don't need to reduce the number of pixels to print. You also do not need to make a virtual copy to print. You don't need to export the file to print. Printing directly from a raw file that's been developed that has a full range of tones is going to be just fine. If you want the page bleed and the rulers and margins and image cells, that's fine, but none of that stuff is going to print. I'm recommending that you make sure this is on, if only for the dimensions. There are all kinds of extra options here. We're not going to go into those right now. What we're interested in is what are the settings that we're going to need in order to get a good translation of what we're seeing on our monitor coming out of the printer. It looks like this is pretty well set up, and we have the profile, but there are a bunch of settings outside of Lightroom in the Epson driver that need to be considered and set. In order to get those, we click on Print Settings here at the bottom, which opens this dialog box, which might be tiny when it first opens. I'm going to recommend that you scroll this open, take a look here, and then make sure that you realize that these little triangles show you hidden menus. The most important one is under Printer Options, and in this case, it's Printer Settings. So when I click on the triangle to open Printer Options and click on Printer Settings under I for information, this opens this dialog box that is also critical. It is here that we choose the media type, and it should match the profile. It should match the paper that we're using. This is not a translator. It's not an ICC profile. It's just informing the printer what kind of paper you're using so it can use an appropriate amount of ink. The other settings that are important here is that this print mode should be blacked out. Under advanced color settings, Epson color management should be off. We're doing the color managing in Lightroom, and so we don't want a second set of color management here. So this should all be grayed out. 16-bit is great, regardless of whether or not your image is 16-bit. And it's here that you get to choose your resolution. This is not the resolution of your image. This is telling the Epson driver how fine a matrix of dots you would like the inkjet printer to lay down. For exhibition quality prints, it is my opinion that 1440 is great. You don't need 2880. In the later printers, after my 3880, like the Epson P800, the Epson P900, this will say, I think, super quality, high quality, and quality. It's the equivalent of 2880, 1440, and 720. So you don't need the highest quality. Again, you might want to check the web about this. The second highest quality is generally really, really good. So these settings are critical. It's not necessary to do color matching. Again, this should be grayed out. It's not necessary to do anything about paper handling or about layout. Occasionally, if you're printing with roll paper or if you're printing with super thick papers, you'll need to go into these dialog boxes and perhaps increase the platen gap. But for now, for what we're doing, this is great. So once I have my printer settings, one of the things that I can do is I could save these as a preset. And so what you might notice is that I could save these current settings as a preset, or I could go into previously saved presets. And what you'll find is that when I open up the print settings dialog box, it's already filled in those blanks for me. In general, I recommend checking and double checking every setting because occasionally the driver glitches and it might change those settings. So if the page setup looks the way you want it to look, if the margins look symmetrical and what you got is the numbers look symmetrical, if you have selected the correct page setup, that is the correct paper size, and I'm recommending borderless retained size, and you also have the correct printer selected, and you have the correct profile selected here, this should be all you need. Occasionally, what you'll find is that the print prints too dark. That may be a failure of the system and not your fault at all. The way I recommend correcting that is to click on print adjustment and increasing the brightness, perhaps 20 or 25%. I think what you'll find is that using this system, you'll get a high correlation between what you're seeing on your calibrated monitor and what you see coming out of the printer. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, you can always contact me. Have a nice day.